Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back in time, not just to any place, but to a very specific, and I mean very specific, version of ancient Greece. We're going to peel back the pristine white marble of your imagination and get our hands dirty in the actual gritty and often baffling reality of 5th century BCE Athens. This isn't the Greece of heroic myths and perfectly symmetrical statues you see in museums. You'd probably be utterly overwhelmed by the smell within the first hour. It's a world built on ideas that are both profound and profoundly uncomfortable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world. And as we settle in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how this little community of ours spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into 2 nights' journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't the grandeur but the heat. The Attic sun is relentless, beating down on the dusty road that leads you through the city gates. The air is thick, a heavy cocktail of scents baking bread from a nearby stall, the sharp tang of olive oil, the earthy smell of clay pots, and something less pleasant. A mix of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and waste that clings to the back of your throat. High above, perched on its rocky throne, the Acropolis gleams, the Parthenon still new and painted in vibrant colors. We can only guess at today. Looks like a promise of order, of divine perfection. But down here where you stand, it's chaos. You're in Athens, the cradle of democracy, the home of Socrates and Plato. But right now, it feels less like a philosophical haven and more like a sprawling, noisy, and slightly sticky marketplace. The streets are narrow, are paved lanes of packed earth. You have to watch your step to avoid stepping in a puddle of something you'd rather not identify. A donkey, laden with amphorae of wine, jostles past you, its owner shouting something incomprehensible. Children in simpletonics chase each other through the crowd, their laughter sharp and clear. This is the reality behind the ideal. You wander towards the heart of the city, the Agora. This is the central hub, the beating heart of Athenian life. This is our first big, mainstream history fact of the night. The Agora was far more than a market. It was the center for everything: commerce, politics, justice, and gossip. You see men everywhere, gathered in small groups under the shade of colonnades, their hands gesturing wildly as they debate. They're discussing politics, philosophy, the price of grain, the latest play by Sophocles. Their voices create a low, constant hum. You see stalls selling everything from fresh fish to intricately woven fabrics and imported spices. This is where deals are made, fortunes are won and lost, and reputations are forged. As you navigate the throng, you learn a crucial lesson in Athenian city living. A window opens from the second story of a cramped-looking house, and a woman's arm unceremoniously dumps a bucket of wastewater onto the street below. You jump back just in time. There's no centralized sewage system here, a little known but deeply impactful fact of daily life. Waste, both human and household, often just went out the window. Historians debate whether it was common practice to shout a warning, but you make a mental note to never walk too close to the buildings. It adds a certain unpredictability to your stroll. You feel a sense of anonymity in the crowd, yet you also feel like an outsider. The people who matter here, the ones conducting business and holding loud debates, all seem to know each other. They are the citizens, and you'll soon learn just how exclusive that club is. For now, you just observe. You notice the way they carry themselves, a sort of casual confidence, as if they own the very ground they walk on. Just how many people are crammed into this sun-baked basin of a city? That's a question scholars are still fiercely debating. Estimates range wildly, but to you, standing in the middle of it all, it feels like the entire population of the known world has decided to gather in the Agora today. As the sun begins to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the city's mood shifts. The intense heat of the day subsides into a warm, balmy evening. The crowds in the Agora start to thin out as men head home for their evening meal or, for the wealthier ones, to a symposium, a private drinking party. The shadows in the narrow alley stretch longer, becoming darker, more mysterious. Wall lamps begin to flicker to life in the doorways of homes and taverns, casting a soft, unsteady glow. The sounds change too. The cacophony of the market is replaced by the distant sound of music, the murmur of conversation from behind closed doors, and the occasional burst of drunken laughter. Athens by night feels like a different city, entirely more intimate, but also more secretive. The grand ideas debated under the sun give way to more earthly pursuits in the flickering lamplight. You get the distinct feeling that this city has two faces, one of logic and light, and another that thrives in the shadows. The night air feels kinder on your skin, but the city doesn't sleep. It merely changes its rhythm. As you linger in the growing twilight near the edge of the now quiet Agora, you watch the men heading off into the labyrinthine streets. They walk with a certain stride, a sense of ownership. These are the men you saw debating earlier, the ones who run this city. And it dawns on you that to understand anything about ancient Athens, its philosophy, its art, its secrets, you first have to understand who these men are. They are the polites, the citizens. A word that sounds simple, but is in fact a jealously guarded, fiercely protected status. So who gets to be a citizen? It's not about being born within the city walls. It's about blood. To be an Athenian citizen, a man must be freeborn, and crucially, both of his parents must be Athenian citizens. This is a major, non-negotiable rule, formally solidified by the statesman Pericles in 451 BC. This law was a game-changer. It slammed the door shut on the children of Athenian men and foreign women, making citizenship an exclusive, hereditary club. Having just an Athenian father was often enough. Now the walls of the club were higher and thicker, and being a member came with incredible perks: the right to vote in the assembly, to serve on juries, to hold public office, and critically, the right to own land in the territory of Attica. These rights are the bedrock of their world, the source of that confidence. Tried, you see. As this sinks in, you start to do the math. You look around at the ghosts of the day's crowd. You think of the women you saw. Glimpses of them in doorways are making brief, purposeful trips to the public fountain. They may be of citizen stock, daughters and wives of these men, but they are not citizens in the political sense. They have no vote, no public voice. Their role is entirely domestic. Then you think of the merchants in the Agora, some with different accents and styles of dress. Many of them are metics or resident foreigners. They are free people, often skilled craftsmen or traders who are vital to the Athenian economy. They pay taxes. In fact, a special tax just for being a Metican can be called to serve in the military. But they can never vote, never hold office, and never own land. They are permanent outsiders, living and working within a city that will never fully accept them. And then there's the largest group of all, the one that makes this entire system possible: the slaves. You saw them throughout the day carrying heavy loads, working in the silver mines you heard about, serving food, attending to children. They are considered property, with no rights, no freedom, no legal personhood. How many of them were there? This is one of those questions where historians essentially just throw up their hands and start arguing. We have no reliable census. Some scholars estimate there was one slave for every citizen family. Others argue the ratio was much, much higher, perhaps outnumbering the free population entirely. Their forced labor is the invisible engine that powers Athens, granting the citizen men the one resource they valued above all else: leisure time. Time to practice politics, to debate philosophy, to create art. Here's a peculiar little detail about how this system was maintained. There were no birth certificates or government-issued IDs. So how did you prove you were a citizen? When a boy turned 18, his father would take him to a meeting of their deme. A deme was a sort of local borough or village, the smallest administrative unit of Athens. There, in front of all the other male citizens of that deme, the father would swear an oath that this boy was his legitimate son, born of a citizen wife. The members would then vote on whether to accept the boy into their ranks. Imagine the anxiety of that. If they voted yes, he was officially enrolled. If they voted no, maybe because of a family feud or a rumor about his mother's true heritage, he could be cast into a legal limbo, his status and his entire future thrown into question. It wasn't a bureaucratic process, it was a deeply personal and potentially political one. You stand there, a silent observer in the dark, and you realize your own status in this world. You have none. You are not a citizen with a voice in the assembly. You are not a metic with a business in the market. You are not a slave with a master to obey. You are simply other, and you grasp a fundamental truth. The grand experiment of Athenian democracy, the rule by the people, was ruled by a very specific, very small percentage of the people. All the wisdom of the philosophers you've heard about, it all rests on this rigid, tiered pyramid of humanity. The stories we're about to uncover, the relationships and norms, all unfold within this strict framework. Who you were allowed to love, how you were allowed to live, and what your life was worth all depended on which rung of this ladder you stood upon. The next morning you decide to follow the citizens. Where do they go after they've had their simple breakfast of bread dipped in wine? They don't head to an office or a factory. For many, the day begins not in the chaotic Agora, but in a place far more ordered, a place that is exclusively almost sacred lie, male the gymnasium. You find one on the outskirts of the city, an open-air complex of colonnades and running tracks, set among a grove of olive trees. The name gymnasium itself comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. And that's the first thing you notice. The men here are exercising completely nude. It's not presented with any sense of shame or bravado. It's just the way things are done. This nudity is a key part of their cultural identity, a visual marker that distinguished the Greeks from the barbarians to the east, who they found it scandalous and ridiculous to exercise in trousers. The air here is different from the Agora. It's filled with the sounds of exertion, the thud of feet on packed earth, the whir of a discus slicing through the air, the grunts of wrestlers grappling in a sandpit. You see men of all ages, young boys, barely teenagers, are being instructed by older trainers. Lean, muscular men in their 20s are competing fiercely, their bodies glistening with a mixture of sweat and olive oil. Yes, that's another thing before exercising. They would rub olive oil all over their bodies. It was thought to be good for the skin and muscles. Afterwards, they would use a special tool called a strigular curved metal scraper to scrape the oil, sweat, and dirt off their skin. It was their version of a shower. Archaeologists have found piles of these discarded strigils, a strange, intimate artifact of daily life. But the gymnasium is not just a sports center. It's a social club, a classroom, and a political salon all in one. As you walk under the shade of a portico, you see older, respected citizens who are past their athletic prime. They're not here to wrestle, they're here to talk. They sit on stone benches, watching the youths and engaging in deep conversation. You might even spot a famous philosopher like Socrates, who was known to frequent these places, striking up conversations with the young, athletic men, challenging their assumptions about life, virtue, and knowledge. The gymnasium was a breeding ground for both physical fitness and intellectual debate. This is where a young man learned not just how to throw a javelin, but how to be an Athenian. He absorbed the culture, the politics, the unspoken rules of society, all while working to achieve the physical ideal, a body that was strong, graceful, and perfectly proportioned. This brings us to a core tenet of their world, kalokogathia. It's a mouthful of a word, but it's a crucial concept. It's the belief that physical beauty and moral goodness are intertwined. A beautiful body was seen as a reflection of a good and noble soul. This is a mainstream historical idea, the philosophical underpinning for their obsession with athletics and the male form. It's why those statues look the way they do. They aren't just portraits, they're expressions of an ideal, a fusion of outer perfection and inner virtue. The men striving in the sandpit aren't just getting fit, they are engaging in a moral and aesthetic pursuit. Now for a peculiar, less idealized detail. While the atmosphere is one of disciplined training and high-minded conversation, it's also a place of intense observation and courtship. The older men aren't just admiring the athletic prowess of the youths. They are also looking for potential protégés, for boys who are not just physically beautiful, but also show promise of a sharp mind and good character. This is the setting where the relationships that will define our story often begin. It's a marketplace of a different kind, where the currency isn't coins, but beauty, charm, and potential. The glances exchanged between the older, bearded men Aristes and the smooth-cheeked adolescent Siramenos are laden with meaning. A nod of approval from a powerful citizen, a blush from a promising youth. These are the opening moves in a complex social dance. Historians are still debating just how openly and explicitly this scouting took place, but face paintings on written texts leave no doubt that the gymnasium was the primary stage for it. As you stand by a column, trying to be inconspicuous, you realize this is a world with its own language of glances, gestures, and unspoken understandings. It's a world where physical training is inseparable from social and intellectual grooming. It's profoundly and unapologetically male. The women are absent, their existence barely acknowledged. This space, with its oiled bodies, philosophical debates, and charged glances, is one of the two poles of a citizen's life. The other, as you will soon see, is the home, and it is a world away, leaving the sun-drenched, masculine world of the gymnasium behind. You begin to pick up on the whispers and philosophical chatter that define the city's intellectual life. The conversations you overhear aren't just about politics or the harvest, they often drift towards a topic that seems to fascinate the Athenian elite: love. But the love they speak of, with a capital L, isn't the romantic, companionate love between a husband and wife that modern culture often idealizes. When they speak of the highest, most noble form of affection, they are almost always referring to pederasty. This is perhaps the most challenging and alien concept for a modern observer to grasp, so let's approach it as they did through the lens of philosophy and social structure. In its idealized form, pederasty was presented as a core institution for educating the next generation of citizens. It was a formal relationship between an older, established adult male citizen, the Aristes the lover, and an adolescent boy, the Eromenos the beloved, just past puberty but not yet a full adult with a beard. You find yourself drawn to a discussion happening under a shady olive tree, a group of men reclining as they talk. They're quoting Plato's Symposium, a foundational text for understanding this concept. This is our big historical touchstone for the chapter. Plato's philosophical dialogues, especially the Symposium and Phaedrus, are our primary sources for the idealized version of these relationships. In this dialogue, various speakers give speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love. The arguments they make are startling. They contend that the love between a man and a boy is superior to the love between a man and a woman. Why? Because they argue it is a love based on the mind and the pursuit of virtue, not just on physical procreation. The theory went like this: the Aristes, the older man, was meant to be a mentor. He was attracted to the boy's physical beauty. Yes, they were very open about that, but this physical attraction was supposed to be a starting point, a hook. The Aristes would guide his young beloved, teaching him about politics, ethics, courage, and how to be a good citizen. He would introduce him to influential people, help him navigate the complex social world of Athens, and serve as a role model. The relationship was meant to be a kind of apprenticeship for civic life. In return, the Eromenos was to offer his youth and beauty as an inspiration for the older man to achieve noble deeds. The very presence of his beloved on the battlefield, for instance, was thought to make an Aristes fight more bravely. This ideal is everywhere in their high culture. You see it depicted on pottery: the older, bearded man offering a gift, often a hare or a rooster, symbols of a lover's pursuit to a slender, beardless youth. The poses are often formal, one gesturing, embodying that mentor-student dynamic. You hear it in the poetry and the political speeches. It was woven into the fabric of the elite male experience. The famous The Band, Sacred Band, an elite unit of soldiers, was said to be composed of 150 pairs of these lovers, who were believed to fight with unmatched ferocity to protect and impress one another. But even as you listen to these lofty justifications, a sense of unease creeps in. The power imbalance is palpable. The Aristes is a false citizen with wealth, status, and influence. The Eromenos is a youth, still finding his place in the world, dependent on the guidance and favor of his elders. What did the boys themselves think of this? Their voices are almost entirely absent from the historical record. The literature is written by the men for the men. Here's a curious, and perhaps telling detail: the language used to describe the ideal conduct of the Eromenos. He was not supposed to appear eager or to take pleasure in the physical aspect of the relationship. He was expected to be modest, reserved, and almost reluctant. To show too much enjoyment was considered unmanly and dishonorable. The prize for the boy was not pleasure, but the social and educational benefits he received. The entire system was constructed to preserve the dignity and masculine honor of both parties. But it was a very carefully choreographed performance. Historians still argue intensely over the gap between this philosophical ideal and the lived reality. Was it a noble form of mentorship that sometimes tipped into something more? Or was it a system of exploitation dressed up in pretty, philosophical language? The truth, as is often the case, was likely messy and varied wildly from one relationship to the next. As the sun sets, casting long shadows once again, you ponder this strange institution. It was a relationship built on a foundation of inequality, justified by the highest philosophical ideals. It was both a public institution, recognized and discussed openly, and a private, intimate bond. It was seen as essential to the creation of good men, yet it operated in a gray area of social etiquette and unspoken rules. You realize you've just scratched the surface. You need to look closer at the transaction. The philosophical ideals are one thing, but how did this system actually work on the ground? You shift your focus from the high-minded debates to the practical, everyday interactions. You start to see the pederastic relationship not as a Socratic dialogue, but as a complex social contract, an unwritten exchange with clear, if unspoken terms. It was, in many ways, a transaction. The scene shifts back to the gymnasium, but now you're watching with a more cynical eye. You see a wealthy, well-regarded citizen, a man in his late 30s named, let's call him Des. He's not watching the discus throwers anymore. His attention is fixed on a boy of about 16, the Otimos. The Otimos is handsome, yes, but he also comes from a respectable but not particularly wealthy family. His father is a citizen, but he doesn't have the connections to launch his son into the upper echelons of Athenian society. Des sees an opportunity. The Otimos sees a path. What does Des, the Aristes, offer? It's far more than just mentorship. He provides tangible, life-altering benefits. He will invite the Otimos to exclusive symposia or drinking parties where the boy will meet influential generals, politicians, and playwrights. These are networking events of the highest order. A casual conversation in one of these settings could lead to a future political alliance or a prime spot in the military cavalry. Des will give him expensive gifts, a fine cloak, a hunting dog, maybe even a horse, a significant symbol of status. This is not just generosity, it's a public display. When people see the Otimos with these things, they know he is favored by a powerful man, which elevates his own social standing. Des also provides an education that goes beyond what a standard schoolmaster could offer. He'll teach the Otimos not just philosophical concepts, but practical politics, who to trust in the assembly, which factions are on the rise, how to deliver a persuasive speech. This is insider knowledge, the kind that creates leaders. He is, in essence, a sponsor, a patron. He is investing in the boy's future, and by extension his own network of influence. And what does the Otimos, the Iromenos, provide in return? On the surface, he offers his youth, beauty, and companionship. His presence at Des's side is a status symbol for the older man, demonstrating his taste, his ability to attract a desirable youth. But it's more than just being decorative. He is expected to be attentive, respectful, and to embody that ideal of youthful modesty. His good reputation reflects back on his patron. Then there is the physical aspect, the part that is spoken of in whispers and euphemisms. The relationship was expected to have a physical dimension. However, the social code surrounding it was incredibly strict and, to a modern mind, contradictory. The central idea, and our key historical concept here, is the preservation of the boy's masculinity. The Iromenos was never supposed to be seen as sexually submissive in the way a woman or a slave would be. The most socially acceptable form of physical intimacy was intersi-raw sex, or thigh-in, where the older man would be between the youth's thighs. This was seen as less demeaning for the boy, as it avoided direct penetration, which was associated with feminization and a loss of honor for the passive partner. Here's a bizarre detail that highlights this anxiety: the timing of it all. The relationship had a very specific shelf life. It was only acceptable as long as the boy was a boy. The moment the Otimos starts to grow a proper beard, the entire dynamic must change. The physical relationship has to end. For him to continue in the beloved role past the bloom of youth would be a source of immense shame and ridicule for both parties. He is now a man and is expected to transition into the role of an Aristes himself, seeking out his own young beloved. The system was designed to be a temporary phase, a stepping stone to proper adult masculinity. This is where the debate among historians rages. Was this transcational nature a corruption of a purer, educational ideal, as Plato seemed to suggest, or was the educational aspect just a convenient and noble-sounding excuse for a system that was, at its core, about powerful men using their status to gain access to beautiful youths? The answer is probably yes to both. For some, it may have been a genuinely affectionate and educational mentorship. For others, it was likely a cold, calculated exchange of social advancement for physical intimacy. There was no single, uniform experience. You watch Lycum Des approach the OTI Moss, not with a philosophical treatise, but with a simple invitation: my friends are gathering tonight. I would be honored if you would join us. The boy looks to his friends, a flicker of pride and anxiety in his eyes, before giving a slight respectful nod. The deal has been struck. The first payment in a long series of transactions has just been made, not with coins, but with a glance and a word, and the OTI Moss has taken his first step on a path that could lead to glory or to ruin, all depending on how well he plays the game. You decide to follow that invitation, to become a silent observer at the symposium Lycum Des mentioned. But before you can even get to the party, you witness the intricate and often public dance of the courtship itself. This isn't a private affair hidden behind closed doors. The pursuit of an Eromenos by an Aristes was a semi-public performance, with its own set of rules and rituals. The process often began, as you saw, in the gymnasium or the Agora, but it quickly moved into the streets. An Aristes might spend hours, even days, essentially loitering near the boy's home or the school he attended. This wasn't seen as creepy stalking, but as a demonstration of his serious intent and devotion. He was making a public statement: I am interested in this boy. It was a bit like a peacock displaying his feathers. He would try to displaying his feathers. He would try to catch the boy's eye, to be seen by the boy's family and the neighborhood. The next step was the giving of gifts. As we touched on, these weren't just random trinkets. They were symbolic. A common gift was a rooster. Why a rooster? It seems odd, but roosters were known for their feisty, competitive nature, and they were often used in cockfights, a popular pastime. Gifting a rooster was like saying, I admire your spirit, and it was a classic, almost cliché, move in the courtship playbook. Another popular gift was a hare, which was a symbol of the hunt and a nod to the boy's swiftness and beauty. These gifts would be presented publicly, for all to see, but the boy, the Eromenos, had to play his part perfectly. His role was to be aloof, almost disdainful. He was not supposed to accept the gifts immediately or appear eager. This was a crucial part of the performance. This is a core concept. The feigned reluctance of the Eromenos was essential for preserving his honor. To seem too willing would suggest he was selling his affections, which would make him seem effeminate and cheapen his value. He had to act as if he was being won over, slowly and reluctantly, by the suitor's good character and persistent devotion, not by his material offerings. It was a test for the Aristes too. Was he patient? Was his interest genuine? Or would he give up at the first sign of rejection? You witness a scene that plays out like a small, silent drama. An older man stands across the narrow street from a boy who is talking with his friends. The man holds a small, elegantly crafted lyre. He wants to give it to the boy. The boy sees him, acknowledges his presence with the barest of nods, and then deliberately turns his back, laughing at something his friend said. The suitor doesn't move. He just waits, patient, holding the lyre. He is playing his role. Everyone who walks by understands the language of this little tableau. The boy's feigned indifference only makes him more desirable. Here's a truly bizarre piece of this ritual: the comoes. If a suitor was feeling particularly passionate, or had had too much to drink at a symposium, he might end his night by leading a drunken procession of his friends to the beloved's house. There, in the middle of the night, he would stand outside the door, singing love songs or what passed for them, and trying to persuade the boy to let him in. He might even try to break the door down, not out of real aggression, but as a theatrical display of his overwhelming passion. This was the comoes. It sounds like harassment, And it probably was, but it was also a conventional, recognized part of the courtship. The question of how families, especially fathers, reacted to this is something historians still puzzle over. Did they see it as an honor, a sign that their son was desirable to a powerful man, or was it an annoyance they had to tolerate as evidence for both perspectives? The ultimate goal of this public dance was for the boy to finally yield. Not in a moment of private weakness, but through a calculated, family-approved acceptance. Often, the boy's father or guardian would play a role, sanctioning the relationship once he was satisfied that the suitor was of good character and high status. This acceptance wasn't just the boy's decision, it was a strategic move for the entire family. A well-chosen heiress could be a powerful ally for the whole clan. So when the Imos gave that slight nod to Lycomdes back in the gymnasium, it was the culmination of a long, public process of observation, posturing, and negotiation. You realize that what might look like a simple invitation is actually the end of a chapter and the beginning of a new one. The courtship is over, the relationship is about to begin, and the symposium is the first official, public viewing of this new alliance. As you continue to observe this strange social landscape, you can't shake a persistent feeling of unease. You've heard the philosophical justifications, you've seen the public rituals, but the line between mentorship and exploitation seems perilously thin, almost invisible. It's a grey area that the Athenians themselves seem to grapple with, and it's a space where historians today spend a great deal of their time locked in fervent debate. You focus again on the Imos, the young Eromenos. He has accepted the courtship of Lycomdes. He now has a powerful patron. His path to a good position in society is paved. But what is the real cost? The ideal, as Plato would have it, is that Lycomdes is genuinely interested in the boy's intellectual and moral development. He will teach the Imos to be virtuous. But what if Lycomdes is not a fermentor? What if he's just a powerful man who desires the boy's company and physical presence, and the education is merely a convenient fiction? The entire system is predicated on the consent of the Eromenos and his family. But what does consent truly mean when there is such a staggering power differential? The Imos's family is not wealthy. Rejecting the advances of a man like Lycomdes might not just be a missed opportunity, it could be dangerous. They could make a powerful enemy. The pressure on the boy and his family to say yes would have been immense. Is it truly a choice when one option is so clearly beneficial and the other is fraught with social and economic peril? This is the central, unresolvable tension of the entire institution. For every relationship that may have been a genuinely positive and educational experience, there were likely many others that were coercive. The problem is that our sources, the plays, the court speeches, the philosophy are all written by men like Lycomdes. The voice of the Imos is silent. We have to read between the lines to look for the cracks in the official narrative, and you start to see them. You come across fragments of legal speeches. For instance, in Athenian law, there was a concept called hybris. This is a crucial term. It doesn't just mean pride or arrogance, it means an act of outrageous insolence, an abuse of power intended to humiliate someone. Here is our key historical point. Hybris was a serious crime, and it was all about the intent to dishonor, not just the physical act itself. A man could be prosecuted for hybris against a freeborn boy, but the legal arguments are revealing. They rarely focus on the boy's trauma or emotional state. Instead, they focus on the dishonor brought upon the boy and his family. The crime wasn't the act itself, but the fact that a citizen in the making was treated like a slave or a woman, robbing him of his future status and honor. It was a crime against the social order. Then there's the flip side, the less discussed but equally real phenomenon of the boy or his family trying to exploit the heiress. You hear whispers of a young man who is a little too good at attracting wealthy suitors, who moves from one to the next, collecting expensive gifts and favors. He is criticized for being manipulative and mercenary. There was a clear, if fine line between being a respected Eromenos and being seen as something akin to a male prostitute. The key difference was in the performance of reluctance and the appearance of not benefiting too directly or too eagerly from the material aspects of the relationship. And here's a strange, almost contradictory societal attitude. While pederasty was an accepted, even celebrated, institution among the elite, There was a law that stated that any citizen who had worked as a prostitute was barred from speaking in the assembly. This is the law against it imia, or the loss of civic rights. Here's the crazy part, and the source of endless scholarly debate: did this apply to a boy who was an eromenos in a pederastic relationship? Some ancient writers say yes, some say no. The line between being a kept boy in an acceptable pederastic relationship and being a prostitute was dangerously blurry. It seems to have depended entirely on public perception, on whether the boy was seen as having sold himself versus having entered into an honorable mentorship. It was a gamble. A young man like the Otimos was walking a tightrope. One misstep, one rumor, one powerful enemy, and his reputation could be ruined. His future political ambitions destroyed. Do you realize that the ideal of pederasty was just that, an ideal? The reality was a messy, dangerous, and morally ambiguous landscape. It was a system ripe for abuse, built on power imbalances, and governed by a complex and often contradictory set of unwritten rules. For a young man, it was a crucial phase of life that could make or break him. He had to navigate the desires of powerful men, the expectations of his family, and the ruthless judgment of public opinion. He was not just a student, he was a player in a high-stakes game where the rules were constantly shifting, and the voices of the most vulnerable were almost never heard. The beautiful, serene vase paintings of the bearded man and the graceful youth hide a world of anxiety, calculation, and risk. Now let's leave the male-dominated public spaces, the gymnasium, the Agora, the political assembly, and step across a threshold into another world. It's a world that is just as fundamental to Athenian society, but it is a world of interiors, of enclosure, and of silence. You are entering the private home of an Athenian citizen, and more specifically, you are heading for the gynaeceum, the women's quarters. The first thing that strikes you is the layout of the house itself. A typical well-to-do Athenian house was designed to look inward. It presented a blank, windowless face to the noisy, dirty street. You enter through a single, solid door into a small courtyard, which is open to the sky. All the rooms of the house open onto the central courtyard. It creates a sense of seclusion, of a world turned in on itself, away from the public gaze. The design is a physical manifestation of the sharp division between the public life of men and the private life of women. The gynaeceum, or gynae, icon was a dedicated section of the house reserved exclusively for the women of the household, the wife, her daughters, and the female slaves. Where was it located? This is one of those seemingly simple questions that historians love to argue about. For a long time, the common belief was that it was always on the upper floor, physically separating the women from the ground floor public areas where the man of the house would receive male guests. This idea comes from some literary sources and seems logical. However, archaeological excavations of Athenian houses have complicated this picture. Many houses don't show a clear, separate upstairs-downstairs division. Instead, it seems the women's quarters were often a series of rooms at the back of the house, away from the front entrance. The key principle wasn't necessarily vertical separation, but a separation of space, public at the front, private at the back. You pass through the courtyard and head towards these back rooms. The atmosphere changes instantly. The sounds of the street are gone, replaced by the low hum of domestic activity. You hear the rhythmic cracking of a loom, the murmur of female voices, the cry of a baby. This is the domain of the citizen wife. Her entire world is largely confined to this space. Her primary, and in many ways, sole purpose in life is to be a good manager of this household oikos and, most importantly, to produce legitimate children, especially a male heir, to carry on the family line and the citizen roster. This is the fundamental role of a citizen wife, a cornerstone of the entire social and political structure. She is the guardian of the family's legitimacy. Her seclusion is a practical measure to ensure the paternity of her children. The only way a man could be certain his son was his own was to keep his wife shielded from any contact with other men. Her honor and the honor of the entire family depended on her sexual fidelity, which was enforced by her physical confinement. Inside the gynaeceum, women engaged in their primary task, weaving. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a major economic contribution to the household and a symbol of female virtue. This is our core knowledge point. Weaving was the quintessential activity, of a respectable woman. A woman who was skilled at the loom was praised as a good wife. The epic poems are full of virtuous women, like Penelope, waiting for their husbands unweaving. You see them spinning wool into thread and then working on a large, upright loom, creating the fabric for the family's clothes and blankets. Now for a small, everyday detail that speaks volumes about their lives. What did these rooms look like? They were likely sparsely furnished. You might see some wooden chests for storing clothes, some simple stools, and maybe a more ornate chair moss for the lady of the house. The walls might have been painted, but it was nothing like the grand public buildings. But a key feature would have been the clay pots. Archaeologists find specific types of pottery associated with the gynaeceum, such as the pyxis, a small round box for holding cosmetics or jewelry, and the epineton, a curious ceramic device shaped to fit over the thigh, used to help prepare wool for spinning. These objects, intimate and functional, are some of the few artifacts that give us a direct glimpse into the texture of their daily life. The wife of the citizen, the Kyria, was the manager of this little world. She directed the female slaves, managed the household supplies, cared for the young children, and nursed the sick. She held the keys to the storerooms, a symbol of her domestic authority. But this authority was entirely delegated to her by her husband, her Kyrios or lord, who had legal control over her and the entire household. She could not leave the house without his permission, except for religious festivals or funerals, and maybe a quick chaperone trip to the public fountain. Her world was small, contained, and intensely monitored. It was a life of duty, responsibility, and profound isolation from the vibrant, intellectual world her husband inhabited just a few meters away. From the quiet confines of the Gynaeceum, you turn your attention to the event that brought the citizen wife here in the first place, her marriage. If you're imagining a romantic affair, a man and a woman falling in love and deciding to build a life together, you need to erase that image completely. An Athenian marriage, especially in the citizen class, was not a union of hearts. It was a business transaction, a contract between two families, designed to forge alliances, transfer property, and produce legitimate heirs. The bride and groom often had little to no say in the matter. In fact, they might not even have met before the wedding ceremonies began. The arrangements were made between the groom or his father and the bride's father, who was her legal guardian. Her Kyrios, the bride, was typically very young, often just 14 or 15 years old. The groom, on the other hand, was usually much older, typically around 30. This significant age gap was standard. The reasoning was practical. A man needed to have completed his military service and established himself in public life before taking on the responsibility of a household. A girl was considered ready for marriage as soon as she was physically able to bear children. This age difference immediately established a power dynamic of an experienced man and a very young, inexperienced girl. The core of the marriage arrangement was the dowry. This is the central, non-negotiable part of the deal. The bride's father would provide an area sum of money, or property like land, though its transfer was complex, or valuable goods that would be given to the groom. The dowry was not a gift to the groom to do with as he pleased. Legally, it was still considered the wife's property, and the husband was its trustee. The purpose of the dowry was to provide for the wife's maintenance throughout her life. If the husband divorced her, he was legally required to return the entire dowry to her father or guardian. This was a crucial piece of financial protection for the woman and her birth family, and it also acted as a major disincentive for a man to divorce his wife frivolously. The whole process was formalized in a contract called the enyi, which was essentially a betrothal. It was a public pledge made by the bride's father to the groom, often in front of witnesses, with the word, "I give you this woman for the plowing of legitimate children." That stark, agricultural phrase says it all. It was about procreation, not passion. The wedding itself was a multi-day affair, a process of moving the bride from her father's house to her new husband's house. On the day before the move, the bride would perform rituals in her childhood home. She would make offerings to the gods, particularly Artemis, the goddess of virginity and childbirth. A particularly poignant ritual was the dedication of her childhood toys. She would offer her dolls and other playthings to the goddess, symbolically marking the end of her childhood and her transition into her new role as a wife. Historians still debate the emotional weight of this moment. Was it a sad farewell to youth, or an eager step into adulthood given her age? It was likely a confusing and intimidating experience. On the wedding day itself, the bride would undergo a ritual bath in water carried from a sacred spring. She would be dressed in a special wedding garment, often white, and veiled. The veil was incredibly important, symbolizing her modesty and her status, an untouched virgin. The main event was the wedding feast, held at the bride's father's house. Men and women feasted in separate rooms. The bride would sit with the women, veiled, and would not eat. Her symbolic transfer was the climax of the day. In the evening, a procession would form to escort the bride to the groom's home. She would ride in a chariot, wedged between her new husband and his best man. Paro chose the procession was noisy, with singing and torches to ward off evil spirits. Here's a small, curious detail about this procession. People would throw nuts and figs at the couple, much like we throw rice or confetti today. It was a symbol of fertility, wishing the couple a fruitful union. When they arrived at the groom's house, his mother would be waiting with a torch. The couple would be led to the hearth, the sacred center of the home. They might share a quince, another symbol of fertility. Then the bride would be led to the bridal chamber, and the marriage would be consummated. The friends and family would stand outside the door, singing songs, a custom called the gymnasium to celebrate the union and, let's be honest, to make sure the marriage was indeed consummated. The next day, the bride's family would bring gifts, and she would finally appear unveiled as the new lady of the house. The transaction was complete. She had a new home, a new master, and a new singular purpose. Now that the bride is installed in her new home, veiled and delivered, what becomes of the relationship between husband and wife? The wedding procession, with all its noise and ritual, fades into the quiet, repetitive rhythm of domestic life. The intimacy between the citizen and his wife was not framed by romance, companionship, or even personal affection. The primary, and often sole, purpose of their physical relationship was procreation. That phrase from a marriage contract, for the plowing of legitimate children, was not just a legal formality, it was a literal job description. A citizen man had a duty to the state to produce future citizens. A citizen woman had a duty to her husband and his family line to bear those children. This was the fundamental basis of their union. Affection might grow over time, a sort of quiet respect and partnership in managing the household, but it was not a prerequisite. It was a potential, and often unlikely, bonus. You can imagine the scene. The husband, whose days in the vibrant, intellectual and social world of the city, returns home in the evening. His house is his refuge, a place of order and calm, managed by his wife. He might eat his meal, perhaps with his older male children, but his wife would likely eat separately or serve him and then eat later. Their interaction would be formal. He is her Kyrios, her lord. She is the manager of his domestic sphere. The physical act itself was seen in starkly practical terms. Medical writers of the time, like those in the Hippocratic corpus, wrote about sex not in terms of pleasure, but in terms of health and reproduction. They offered advice on the best times to conceive, the right foods to eat for fertility, and how to produce strong, healthy offspring. This is our main historical point. Ancient Greek medical texts treated sex mechanistically, as a function of health and reproduction, with little to no mention of female pleasure. The concept of a wife's pleasure or satisfaction was, for the most part, entirely absent from the conversation. It was simply not considered relevant to the transaction. In fact, some texts suggest that it was believed a woman's pleasure was not even necessary for conception. This starkly contrasts with the passionate, emotional, and philosophically complex language used to describe the pederastic relationships between men. In those relationships, desire, beauty, and pursuit were central themes. For the marital relationship, the language was one of duty, lineage, and property. The husband had outlets for passion and companionship elsewhere in the gymnasium, at the symposium. The wife had none. Her world was the oikos and her body was the vessel for its continuation. Here's a small, poignant detail that underscores this reality. We have surviving legal speeches from Athenian court cases, and they are incredibly revealing. In one speech by the orator Lysias, a man discovers his wife has been having an affair. He describes how he began to trust her more. He began to trust her more. He moved her quarters from the upstairs floor down to the ground floor to be on the same level as his. He describes this as a sign of his growing affection and trust, but his description of their previous life is with so stark. He says that in the beginning he watched her as well as I could, and kept her under as strict a guard as was possible. He admits that she was a good wife, frugal, a skilled housekeeper, but there is no language of love or emotional connection. The relationship is described in terms of surveillance and management. The affair is a betrayal not of his heart, but of his honor and the legitimacy of his household. Of course, we must be careful not to paint with too broad a brush. Human nature is complex, and it would be foolish to assume that no Athenian husband and wife ever felt deep, genuine love for one another. There are surviving funeral inscriptions and literary passages that hint at real affection and grief. But these seem to be the exception, not the rule. The societal structure, the age gap, the different worlds they inhabited, and the fundamental purpose of their marriage all stacked the odds against a relationship based on mutual, romantic love. The question of whether this duty-bound, procreative model was fulfilling or suffocating for the people within, it is something we can only speculate on. The historical record, written by men, is largely silent on the emotional lives of wives. They were expected to find their fulfillment not in their husbands, but in their children and the successful management of their home. Their lives were a quiet testament to the fact that in ancient Athens, some forms of love were for philosophy and poetry, and others were simply for producing the next generation. You've seen her confined to the home. You've understood her marriage as a contract and her primary role as a bearer of heirs. Now, let's try to grasp the full extent of a citizen wife's invisibility in the world outside her front door. She was not just physically secluded, she was socially and legally erased from public life. Her existence was defined entirely by her relationship to men, first her father, then her husband. Imagine a conversation between two Athenian men in the Agora. If one man, let's call him Theron, were to ask his friend about his family, the friend would respond by talking about his sons. He might mention his aging mother or his unmarried sisters who are still part of his household, but he would almost never, ever mention his wife by name in a public setting. To do so would be a grave breach of etiquette. It would be considered disrespectful to his wife, as it would be drawing public attention to her, and by extension to her sexuality and his private affairs. A woman's name was to be kept within the walls of the home. The famous statesman Pericles, in his renowned funeral oration, summed up the prevailing attitude perfectly. Addressing the war widows, he said, "Your great glory is not to be inferior to what God has made you, and the greatest glory of a woman is to be least talked about by men, whether they are praising you or criticizing you." This social erasure was mirrored in the legal system. A woman could not own property in her own right except for her dowry, which was managed by her husband. She could not enter into a contract for anything worth more than a medimons of barley, a tiny amount, essentially pocket money. She could not represent herself in court. If she was a party to a lawsuit, for instance, in a divorce or inheritance case, she had to be represented by her male guardian. Her kyrios, she was, in legal terms, a perpetual minor regardless of her age or intelligence. This leads to a fundamental aspect of Athenian society, the concept of the kyrios. Every woman, from birth to death, had a male guardian who had legal authority over her. When she was a child, it was her father. It would be her eldest brother, or an uncle, or even her grandfather. When she married, her husband became her kyrios. If her husband died, her kyrios would become her son, assuming he was of age. She was never legally independent. This male guardian made all the important decisions for her: who she would marry, how her dowry would be managed, and how any legal disputes would be handled. Now, for a truly bewildering detail of this system, the epikaleros, this term refers to a woman whose father died without leaving any male heirs. She wasn't an heiress in our sense of the word, because she couldn't inherit the property herself. Instead, she was the property, or rather, she came attached to the property. The estate had to be passed down through the male line, so the law dictated that the closest male relative of her deceased father had the right and often the obligation to marry her in order to claim the inheritance and produce a male heir to continue the family line. This could lead to some truly strange and tragic situations. Imagine a young woman, already married, whose father dies without sons. Her father's nearest male relative, perhaps an uncle she's never liked, or even a cousin, could legally force her husband to divorce her, so that he could marry her and take the family property. The woman's own feelings or desires in the matter were completely irrelevant. She was a pawn in a game of patrilineal inheritance. Historians still debate the frequency of this practice, but its existence in the law speaks volumes about how women were viewed as conduits for property and lineage, not as individuals with their own agency. So, when you see a woman on the streets of Athens, it's a rare sight. And she is never just wandering. She is on a specific, approved errand. She might be going to a neighbor's house to help with a birth. She might be part of a funeral procession for a family member. Most commonly, she might be heading to a public fountain with other women from her neighborhood to fetch water. These trips to the fountain were one of the few socially acceptable opportunities for women to leave the house and interact with their peers. But even then, she would be chaperoned, likely by a trusted female slave. She would walk with her gaze lowered, not making eye contact with the men she passed. She is a fleeting, anonymous figure, a shadow in a world that wasn't built for her. Her story is written not in the grand speeches of the assembly, but in the silence of the gynaeceum and the rigid laws that kept her there. The sun has set, the evening meal is over, and the master of the house, our citizen, is not settling in for a quiet night with his family. Instead, he puts on a fresh cloak, perhaps adorned with a garland of flowers, and heads out into the night. He's not going to a public tavern; those are considered rough, lower-class establishments. He is on his way to one of the defining institutions of Athenian elite social life, the symposium, and you're going to follow him. You arrive at the house of a wealthy friend. The sounds of laughter and music spill out into the dark street. You slip inside, unseen, into the undrawn men's dining room. This room is the male equivalent of the gynaeceum. It is a space designed exclusively for men and their specific brand of entertainment. The room is oft unelaborately decorated with mosaic floors and painted walls. Instead of chairs, there are couches, or clinae, arranged around the walls of the room. The men, usually between 10 and 30 of them, are not sitting up, but reclining on these couches, typically to a couch, propped up on their left elbows. This posture of reclining while eating and drinking was a symbol of luxury and leisure, borrowed from the East. The evening begins with food, but the meal is usually simple and eaten quickly. The symposium proper is not about eating, it's about drinking, and talking, and entertainment. After the food is cleared away, the slaves bring in the wine. But they don't just pour it straight from the amphora. This is a crucial point about Greek drinking habits. They almost never drank their wine neat. To do so was considered barbaric, the mark of an uncivilized drunkard. The wine was always mixed with water in a large, ornate ceramic bowl called a crater. The mixing of the wine was a ritual in itself. A symposium or master of the drinking would be elected from among the guests. He would decide the ratio of wine to water, setting the tone for the night. A ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine was common for a long, philosophical evening. A 1-to-1 mix promised a much wilder night. The symposia also dictated how much each man had to drink and set the topics for conversation. It was an attempt to impose order on what could easily descend into chaos. As the mixed wine is served, the conversation begins to flow. This is where the men could speak freely, away from the formalities of the public assembly. They debated philosophy, recited poetry, told jokes, and gossiped mercilessly about politics and their fellow citizens. It was a space for intellectual bonding, for forging political alliances, and for reinforcing the shared culture of the elite. But the room is not entirely male. There are women here, and this is the moment where the stark social divisions of Athens are thrown into sharp relief. The women present are absolutely not the citizen wives of the men reclining on the couches. A respectable wife would never be present at a symposium. The only women allowed in this space were entertainers. You see flute girls, olos players, dancers, and acrobats, who were almost always slaves. And then there is another class of women, seated among the men, talking, laughing, and even participating in the philosophical debates. She is not a slave, and she is certainly not a wife. This is a bizarre and fascinating contradiction. The very men who kept their wives locked away in seclusion to guarantee their fidelity and honor would spend their evenings drinking and conversing with these other, very different women. A little-known fact about symposia is the games they played. One of the most popular was Cotte Boss. The goal was to flick the dregs of wine from your shallow drinking cup, Achilles, and hit a specific target across the room, usually a small disc balanced on a metal stand. It was a game of skill that required a specific flick of the wrist. Often the player would dedicate his throw to a person he admired, sometimes a politician, but just as often a beautiful youth or a popular hetaira. Imagine this scene: a room of powerful men, reclining on couches, flicking wind dregs across the room while professional entertainers and high-class courtesans look on. It's a world away from the sober image of marble temples and stoic philosophers. Hedonistic side of Athenian life, a place where the strict rules of the outside world were relaxed, and pleasure, in its many forms, was the main pursuit. Your attention at the symposium is now fixed on this fascinating figure. The hetaira. She is unlike any other woman you have encountered in Athens. She is not hidden away in a gynaeceum, nor is she an anonymous slave entertainer. She reclines on a couch, perhaps sharing it with one of the most powerful men in the city. She engages in the witty banter. She understands the philosophical references, and she offers her own opinions. She is, in this exclusive male space, treated almost as an equal. The word hetaira literally translates to female companion, and this is the key to understanding her role. She was not simply a woman who sold her body, she was a companion for the mind as well. This is the primary distinction between her and other prostitutes. This is our main historical point. The hetaira were a distinct class, valued for their intellectual and social skills, not just their physical attractiveness. They were often highly educated, sometimes more so than the citizen wives. They were trained in music, dance, and, most importantly, the art of conversation. They could discuss politics, literature, and philosophy with the most brilliant men of Athens. Where did these women come from? They were rarely Athenian citizens by birth. Most were metics, resident foreigners, or freed slaves. This non-citizen status was actually a source of their freedom. Because they were not bound by the strictures of citizen respectability, they could move about in public, manage their own finances, and cultivate social connections in a way that was impossible for a citizen wife. They were independent businesswomen whose product was a carefully crafted blend of charm, intellect, and beauty. You watch one particular hetaira. Let's call her Narcissus. She is beautiful, yes, but it is her confidence that is most striking. When the symposia proposes a topic for discussion, say, the nature of courage, she doesn't just listen silently. She offers a clever, slightly provocative counterpoint to a statement made by a well-known general. The men don't scoff, they listen. Some laugh in appreciation. The general considers her point and responds. She is participating in the intellectual life of the city in a way a citizen's wife could only dream of. The relationship between a man and a hetaira was often a long-term one. A wealthy man might establish a semi-permanent arrangement with a particular hetaira, essentially setting her up in her own house and becoming her primary patron. This was an expensive and public affair. It was a status symbol. Having a beautiful, witty, and sought-after hetaira on your arm was a sign of wealth, taste, and sophistication. These relationships existed openly, alongside a man's legal marriage. It was not considered adultery in the modern sense, because the hetaira was not a citizen wife. The law and society was concerned with the legitimacy of heirs, something the hetaira could not produce, or if she did have children, they would not be citizens. The wife was for producing sons, the hetaira was for pleasure, companionship, and intellectual stimulation. Here's a curious detail that highlights their unique position. While respectable women were never named in public, famous hetaira were. Their wit was quoted, and their lives were the subject of public gossip and even comedy. We know the names of several famous hetaira from historical texts. The most legendary is Aspasia of Miletus. She was the partner of the great statesman Pericles. She was a foreigner, a mild young known for her incredible intelligence and political savvy. It was said that the greatest thinkers and politicians of Athens, including Socrates, would go to her house to hear her speak and learn from her. Plato himself mentions her. Of course, Pericles' enemies used his relationship with Aspasia to attack him, calling her a brothel keeper and a corrupting influence. This is a point of huge debate for historians. Was Aspasia really a brilliant political mind and teacher, a proto-feminist figure, or was she a canny courtesan whose intelligence was exaggerated by her admirers and used as a weapon by her detractors? The truth is likely somewhere in between. But her fame alone shows the remarkable, if precarious, position a hetaira could achieve. These women were the great paradox of Athenian society. They were outsiders who gained a level of freedom and influence that was denied to the insider citizen women. They thrived in the very spaces from which respectable women were barred. They were admired for their minds, yet their livelihood depended on their physical appeal. They could achieve wealth and fame, but they could never achieve the one thing that mattered most in Athens: the security and status of a citizen. Why? They lived in a gilded cage, free to fly within its boundaries, but a cage nonetheless. You continue to observe Narcissus the hetaira as the symposium wears on. The wine has been flowing for hours now. Some of the men are red-faced and loud, their philosophical debate having devolved into boisterous singing. Others are engaged in quiet, intense conversations. Through it all, Narcissus maintains an air of graceful control. She is, in a very real sense, working, and her work is far more complex than it appears. The companionship she offers is a bespoke service, tailored to the needs and desires of her wealthy patrons. It's a performance of intimacy, a carefully constructed illusion of genuine affection and intellectual connection. This is the art of the hetaira. It's not just about being beautiful. Intelligent man feels seen, heard, and admired. Let's break down what that intellectual companionship really meant in practice. When a man like, say, the general she was debating with earlier, spent his days dealing with the immense pressures of war and politics, he couldn't go home and discuss the strategic nuances of our naval campaign with his 15-year-old wife, whose expertise was in weaving and managing slaves. But he could discuss it with a hetaira. She would have made it her business to be informed about current events. She would know the names of the key players, understand the political factions, and be able to ask intelligent questions. She provided a sounding board, a form of therapy for the ruling class. This is a core concept that is often misunderstood. The hetaira's role was, in part, psychological. She was the one woman a man could talk to as an equal, or something approaching it. The relationship was built on a different kind of truth than marriage. A man's wife was bound to him by non-societal duty. A hetaira was with him by choice, or at least, a choice he paid for. A relationship based on mutual appreciation rather than legal obligation. You watch as a famous playwright, a man known for his brooding tragedies, reclines on a couch, speaking quietly with Narcissus. He is not boasting or laughing. He seems to be confiding in her, his voice low and earnest. She listens, her expression one of deep concentration and empathy. She is providing an emotional outlet that his public life, and likely his private life, did not allow. Now for a specific, almost technical aspect of their skill set. Many hetaira were renowned for their charis, a Greek word that is difficult to translate. It means grace, charm, wit, and a kind of radiant attractiveness that is more than just physical beauty. It was the ability to delight, to captivate an audience. A key part of this was storytelling and humor. A good hetaira could diffuse a tense situation with a well-timed joke, or hold a room spellbound with a witty retelling of a myth. They were professional entertainers in the most sophisticated sense of the word. They were the geishas of the ancient Greek world, masters of social arts that were cultivated to please and engage a powerful male clientele. The financial side of this was, of course, paramount. A successful hetaira could become incredibly wealthy. They were paid handsomely for their time, not just for attending a single symposium, but for longer-term arrangements. They could amass their own fortunes, buy property though this was legally complex for non-citizens, and live a life of luxury that far surpassed that of most Athenian women. However, this wealth was precarious. It depended entirely on her ability to remain desirable. Her career was often short, based on the fleeting qualities of youth and beauty. An older hetaira had to be exceptionally witty and intelligent to retain her clientele. This leads to a question that historians have long debated: what was the ultimate legacy of these women? Were they a liberating force, demonstrating that women could be intellectual and independent, or were they simply a more refined cog in a patriarchal machine? A safety valve that allowed men to have their intellectual companionship without threatening the fundamental structure of the citizen family? There's no easy answer. They existed in a paradox. They were admired for their intelligence, but this intelligence was primarily valued for how it served men. They were independent, but this independence was contingent on the patronage of the very men who denied independence to their own wives and daughters. As the symposium finally winds down and the guests begin to stumble out into the pre-dawn light, you see Nossa's share a final, knowing glance with her main patron. It's a look that is both intimate and professional. She has provided wit, empathy, and intellectual stimulation. She has earned her fee. But you are left wondering about the woman behind the performance, the mind that had to be so sharp, the spirit that had to be so resilient to navigate this brilliant, beautiful, and treacherous world. Leaving the perfumed, wine-scented air of the symposium, you descend. You descend through the social strata of Athens, past the grand houses of the citizens, past the respectable workshops of the metics, down into the squalid, dimly lit other side of this world's economy thrives. Here, there are no philosophical debates or witty repartees. There is only the grim, transcational reality of the common prostitute, the pornee. The very word tells a story. Hetaira means companion. Pornee comes from the verb pern-emi, which means to sell. That is the fundamental brutal distinction. A pornee was a woman, or sometimes a boy, who was for sale. There was no pretense of companionship, no veneer of intellectual engagement. It was a purely commercial transaction for physical relief. Who were these women? Overwhelmingly, they were slaves. They might have been captured in war, born into slavery, or sold as children by destitute families. They had no rights, no agency, no control over their own bodies. They were property, owned by a porno boss coerce a brothel keeper. This was considered one of the most reviled and socially despicable professions in Athens, yet it was a legal and thriving business. A brothel keeper, who was usually a man but could sometimes be a woman, would buy slaves and rent them out for profit. You find yourself in a neighborhood near the port of Piraeus, a rough-and-tumble area frequented by sailors, soldiers, and lower-class laborers. The brothels here are not grand houses. They are cramped, dirty, and often windowless rooms, sometimes marked only by a lit lamp or a crudely painted phallus above the door. The women would be displayed, sometimes in literal cages or behind barred windows, for potential customers to inspect. This is the main historical point for this section. The vast majority of prostitutes in ancient Athens were slaves, living in conditions of extreme exploitation, forming the lowest rung of the social ladder. The experience of a pornee was a world away from the gilded life of a hetaira. She had no say in who her clients were, what acts she was forced to perform, or how many men she had to service in a day. Her life was often one of violence, disease, and utter powerlessness. Let's consider a grimly practical detail: the price. We have evidence from an ancient sources, including comedies and court records, about how much a visit to a brothel might cost. The standard price for the most basic service seems to have been 1 obol. To put that in perspective, there were 6 obols in a drachma. A typical day's wage for an unskilled laborer was about 1 drachma. So a man could buy a few moments with a pornee for 1/6 of his daily income. It was cheap. It was accessible. And this was by design. And even some ancient writers like the statesman Solon argued that the state-regulated brothels were a social necessity. The theory was that by providing a cheap and easy outlet for male sexual desire, unmarried men, it would protect respectable women, the wives and daughters of citizens, from assault. It was a system that sacrificed the bodies of one class of women to protect the honor of another. Historians are still piecing together the daily life in these establishments. We have archaeological evidence of brothels, identical rooms, and the types of pottery found within lots of simple drinking cups. But the human story is harder to find. These women left no records. Their voices are completely lost. We can only infer their suffering from the casual cruelty described in comedic plays or the utter lack of regard for them in legal texts. A slave prostitute could be beaten or even killed by her master with few, if any, legal consequences. There was another category of pornee besides the brothel slave. Some were streetwalkers who worked in the darkest corners of the city, like the area around the Karamika West, the Potter's Quarter and Cemetery. These women might be freed slaves or destitute free women with no other way to survive. They had a sliver more autonomy than a brothel slave, but their lives were even more precarious, subject to violence from clients and harassment from city officials. You see a young woman no older than the citizen wife you saw in the gynaeceum standing in a dark doorway. Her face is painted with cheap, garish cosmetics, white lid for the lips, a touch of red for the lips. It's a sad imitation of the expensive cosmetics used by the hetero eye. A group of drunken sailors approaches. She does not look at them with the confident gaze of Narcissus. Her eyes are empty. She is simply waiting for the transaction to be over. She is the invisible foundation upon which the entire glittering, complex structure of Athenian sexuality is built. Her exploitation allows the citizen wife to remain pure and the hetero to seem special. She is the silent, unaccounted cost of their wealth. The stark reality of the pornee's life forces you to confront the brutal mechanics of the Athenian sex trade. It wasn't a hidden, shameful secret, it was a visible, regulated, and deeply embedded part of the urban landscape. The entire system was built on a foundation of meme-outer bodies with price tags, and the vast majority of those bodies belonged to people who had no say in the matter. Let's zoom in on the grim economics. The $1 price tag for a brothel slave was the rock bottom of the market. This was the price for the lowest status men laborers, sailors, young men without an inheritance. It bought a few minutes in a cramped cell, a purely functional transaction. The brothel keeper, the porno-boss coes, would take the entire fee. The enslaved woman would see none of it. Her payment was her continued survival, a meager ration of food and a place to sleep. As you move up the price scale, the services and the women offering them changed. There were more expensive brothels that catered to a middle-class clientele. Here, the women might be more skilled or considered more beautiful. The price might be several low bowls, or even a full drachma. These establishments might offer more comfort, a couch instead of a dirty mat, but the underlying reality was the same: the women were slaves, and the profits went to their owner. The line between a high-end pornee and a low-end hetero could become blurry. A particularly beautiful or talented slave might be trained by her master to play the flute or to be a witty conversationalist. He could then rent her out for symposia at a much higher rate. She was still his property, but she was marketed as a more refined product. This is where the exploitation becomes more insidious. She is given the trappings of a companion but none of the freedom. This brings us to a key legal and social concept. Slavery was the engine of the entire commercial sex industry. Freeborn Athenian women were, in theory, protected from being forced into prostitution. There were laws against it, but for a slave, there was no protection. A slave's body was not their own. It belonged to their master, who could use it, rent it out, or sell it as he saw fit. This is the fundamental truth that separated the lives of the citizen wife and the hetero from the pornee. No matter how restricted their lives were, the wife in the hetero, if she were free, had a degree of bodily autonomy that was utterly denied to the enslaved prostitute. Now for a peculiar and disturbing detail that illustrates the normalization of this industry. In Athens, there was a specific tax on prostitutes. The state, while despising the brothel keepers, was more than happy to profit from their trade. This tax, the pornikon tell us, legitimized the industry in the eyes of the government. It was just another source of revenue, like a tax on market stalls or harbor fees. The state was not interested in the morality of the business, only in its financial potential. The existence of this tax is one of the main ways historians know that prostitution was widespread and regulated. It wasn't a black market, it was a taxable sector of the economy. The question of whether all prostitutes were slaves is a point of some scholarly debate. There were certainly some free women who were forced into prostitution by poverty, A widow with no family to support her, a woman from a disgraced family, they might have had to turn to this life to survive. But they were the exception. The vast, overwhelming majority were slaves, brought to Athens from all over the known world: Thrace, Lydia, Ionia. You could walk through the brothel district and see women of many different ethnicities, all trapped in the same system. You also can't ignore the male prostitutes. While less common, they were a regular feature of the city. Most were also slaves available for hire by men. The key difference here goes back to that core Greek concept of active versus passive roles. For a citizen man to hire a male prostitute was not necessarily a major social taboo, as long as he was the active partner. The shame and degradation fell entirely on the prostitute, the one who was passive. A freeborn boy who sold himself for money was seen as utterly contemptible, forfeiting his masculinity and any hope of a future as a citizen. As you stand in the shadows, watching this grim marketplace of human bodies, you realize the profound hypocrisy at the heart of Athenian society. A society that produced sublime philosophy on the nature of virtue and justice also created a system that commodified human beings in the most intimate way imaginable. The freedom of the citizen man to pursue pleasure, in all its forms, was paid for by the bondage of thousands of forgotten women and men, whose names we will never know, and whose suffering was considered just a normal part of the price of civilization. From the profane you now turn to the sacred. You might think that the world of religion and temples would be a refuge from the complex and often brutal sexual economy of Athens. You would be wrong. In the ancient Greek world, religion was not a separate sphere of life, concerned only with morality and the afterlife. It was woven into every aspect of society, and that included sex. In some specific, and often sensationalized contexts, the line between religious devotion and sexual activity blurred completely. You decide to take a journey, leaving the bustling streets of Athens for the wealthy, cosmopolitan port city of Corinth. Corinth was famous throughout the ancient world for two things: its strategic location and its temple dedicated to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and desire. Perched high on a fortress-like hill called the Agora, this temple was not just a place of worship, it was notorious for its practice of what has been called sacred prostitution. This is a concept that is as controversial as it is fascinating. The idea, as described by ancient writers like the geographer Strabo, was that the temple owned a large number of female slaves. He claims there were more than 1,000, though this is likely a great exaggeration. These women were referred to as hieroduelo, or sacred slaves. They were dedicated to the service of the goddess Aphrodite, and according to the stories, part of that service involved having sex with male worshippers in exchange for a donation to the temple. This is our big and highly debated historical point for the chapter: the existence and nature of sacred prostitution at places like the Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth. The theory was that a man could go to the temple, make an offering, and then commune with the goddess through a physical union with one of her sacred servants. The act was framed not as simple prostitution, but as a form of religious worship, but a pious donation that brought wealth and favor to the goddess and her city. You can imagine the scene. A wealthy merchant, his ship safely docked in the Corinthian harbor, makes the steep climb up to the Agora. He enters the sacred precinct of the temple, a place of stunning views and religious grandeur. He makes his prayers and offerings at the altar. Then, he is able to choose one of the hieroduelo. The encounter might take place in a designated chamber within the temple complex. The experience was designed to feel different from a visit to a common brothel. It was elevated, sanctified, wrapped in the aura of the divine. Now, we have to inject a heavy dose of scholarly skepticism here. The sacred prostitution of Corinth is one of those topics where the historical evidence is tantalizingly thin and open to interpretation. Our main source, Strabo, was writing centuries after the golden age of classical Greece, and he may have been repeating exoticized rumors. The archaeological evidence from the temple itself is inconclusive. There are no rooms that are definitively sacred brothels. Many historians today are highly critical of the traditional view. They argue that the term hierodoulos might have simply meant any person, male or female, who was a slave owned by the temple, working in any capacity as cleaners, artisans, or administrators. They suggest might have been misunderstandings, or even deliberate slander by rival cities to paint Corinth as decadent and immoral. The debate is fierce and ongoing. Was sacred prostitution a widespread, accepted religious practice, or is it a historical myth born from a combination of exaggeration and misinterpretation? Regardless of the specifics at Corinth, the link between sex and the divine was undeniably real in other contexts. Aphrodite wasn't just the goddess of romantic love, she was the patroness of all forms of sexual desire, including the commercial sex industry. Prostitutes from the high class Hetaira to the lowly Porni would make offerings to Aphrodite, praying for clients on protection. There was no sense of shame in this. They were, in their own way, her practitioners. Here's a smaller, but equally strange example of this fusion. In some parts of the Greek world, there were hermitages dedicated to the god Priapus. Priapus was a minor rustic fertility god, most famous for his enormous, permanently erect phallus. Statues of him, crudely carved and prominently displayed, were common in gardens and orchards, believed to ward off thieves and bring fertility to the crops. Some of these shrines seem to have had a sexual function, where worshippers could perform acts that were, let's just say, in keeping with the god's primary characteristic. It was a raw, earthy, and unapologetic connection between divinity and base human urges, a world away from the lofty philosophy of Plato. So, whether through the grand, controversial temple at Corinth or a humble, phallic shrine in a vegetable patch, the Greeks demonstrated a remarkable ability to integrate the most aspects of human life into their religious worldview. The gods weren't distant, moralizing figures. They were patrons of every facet of human experience, from the battlefield to the bedroom, and even to the brothel. If the sacred prostitution of Aphrodite's temple represents a controlled, almost commercial fusion of sex and religion, then your next experience is its chaotic, untamed, unwildly public counterpart. You are about to witness a festival in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, fertility, and ecstatic madness. And during these festivals, the carefully constructed social rules of Athens, the seclusion of women, the demand for masculine self-control, the orderly conduct of public life were not just bent, they were shattered. There were several Dionysian festivals throughout the year, but the most famous were the rural Dionysia in the winter and the city Dionysia in the spring, which was also the occasion for the great tragic and comic play competitions. You find yourself swept up in a procession for the rural Dionysia, a festival rooted in ancient agricultural rites to promote fertility for the coming year. The atmosphere is one of licensed chaos. It's a public holiday, and the entire community, men, women, children, and slaves, is participating. The central feature of the procession is the biholophoria, the carrying of the phallus. Giant, exaggerated phallic symbols, carved from wood or leather and painted, are paraded through the streets on poles. This isn't meant to be obscene in a titillating way. It's a powerful, magical symbol of fertility and life force, intended to bless the fields and the people. This is our key historical point. The public, ritualistic use of phallic symbols was a common and serious part of Dionysian worship, meant to encourage fertility. As the procession moves through the countryside towards the sanctuary of the god, the mood becomes increasingly unrestrained. Wine flows freely, handed out to everyone. The usual Greek custom of mixing wine with water is largely abandoned. This is about intoxication, about losing your inhibitions. People are singing, but these are not psalm hymns. They are raucous, often obscene songs, full of insults and crude jokes, hurled good-naturedly at both the participants and the spectators. This ritualized jeering was a traditional part of the festival, a way of letting off steam. And what about the women? This is one of the few occasions where citizen wives and daughters were allowed, and even expected, to participate in a public celebration. But they did not participate in the same way as the men. A special role was reserved for a group of women, called the Maenads or Biaicentes, in the Roman tradition. These were the female followers of Dionysus. In myth and ritual, they were said to retreat into the mountains, where, fueled by wine, music, and a frenzied energy, they would enter a state of ecstatic trance. They would dance wildly, their hair unbound, their movements convulsive. In this state of ecstasis, literally standing outside oneself, they were believed to be possessed by the god, endowed with supernatural strength. while the most extreme stories of maenads tearing wild animals apart with their bare hands belong to the realm of myth. The ritualized reenactment was a real and powerful experience. You see a group of women, their faces flushed, their movements uncoordinated yet full of a strange power. They are outside the normal bounds of female decorum. They are loud, they are wild, and they are, for this brief period, terrifyingly free. The question of how much of this was genuine religious ecstasy and how much was a socially sanctioned performance is something historians endlessly debate. Was it a genuine loss of self, or a rare and welcome opportunity for women to escape the suffocating confines of the gynaeceum and experience a sense of collective power and abandon? A curious detail of these festivals, particularly the Anasteria, another Dionysian celebration, was the hero's Gomos sacred marriage. In Athens, this ritual involved the wife of one of the city's chief magistrates, the Archon Basileus, being ritually married to the god Dionysus. The ceremony took place in a specific public building, and while the exact details are shrouded in mystery, it represented a symbolic union of the city with the god of fertility. The idea that the city's most respectable women were involved in these wild, earthy fertility rites shows just how deeply these non-rational, pre-philosophical traditions were embedded in Athenian life. As the Dionysian revelry reaches its peak, you see a world turned upside down. Men and women are drinking together in public. The lines between slave and free are blurred in the drunken chaos. The emphasis is not on order or reason, and control the supposed hallmarks of Athenian civilization, but on their exact opposites: chaos, passion, and release. The very foundations of the social order are temporarily dissolved in the name of the god. It's a reminder that beneath the surface of the rational, democratic city-state there pulsed an older, wilder, and more primal energy. It was an energy that the Athenians both feared and revered, and one that they knew they had to give its due, lest it erupt in more destructive ways. After the wild, ecstatic release of the Dionysian festival, you feel a need for some quiet contemplation. You've seen the social practices, the family structures, and the religious rites. But what did the great thinkers, the men whose names are synonymous with Greek wisdom, have to say about all this? You seek out the philosophers, hoping for some clarity, some moral guidance. What you find, however, is not a unified, damning critique, but a reflection of the same complexities and contradictions you've seen everywhere else. You start with the man who is in many ways the central figure of Athenian intellectual life. Socrates has channeled through his most student Plato. You return to the concept of the symposium, but this time is Plato's famous dialogue of the same name. As you listen to the speakers, you realize Plato's goal is not to condemn the pederastic relationships happening all around him, but to try and elevate them. This is our central historical idea. Plato didn't reject pederasty, he attempted to reform it into a philosophical tool. To the voice of Socrates, Plato argues that physical desire for a beautiful boy is not an end in itself, but the first, lowest rung on a ladder leading to the divine. The true lover, the philosopher, should use this initial physical attraction as a starting point. From loving one beautiful body, he should learn to appreciate all beautiful bodies. He should ascend to loving beautiful souls, then beautiful laws and institutions, and finally, he should catch a glimpse of the ultimate, abstract form of beauty itself. It's a breathtaking intellectual feat. Plato takes the messy, transcational, and often exploitative reality of Athenian pederasty and reframes it as a journey towards transcendent wisdom. H.E.S. not a revolutionary trying to overthrow the system, H.E.S. a reformer trying to purify it. But what about other forms of love in Plato's ideal state? As described in his Republic, the traditional family is abolished entirely for the ruling guardian class. Men and women are to be equal, receiving the same education and training. Mating is to be arranged by the state at special festivals with the goal of producing the best possible offspring. Children are to be raised in communal nurseries, not knowing their biological parents. It's a radical, cold, and calculated vision, driven by logic, not love. For Plato, the intense, private loyalties of the family were a threat to the unity of the state. It's a stark reminder that when philosophers get down to designing a perfect society, the results can be deeply unsettling. Next, you turn to Plato's student. Aristotle was, in many ways, more of a pragmatist and a biologist. He doesn't soar to the same metaphysical heights as Plato. He looks at the world as it is. For Aristotle, the family oikos is the natural and necessary foundation of the state. He sees the relationship between husband and wife as a natural hierarchy, with the man being more rational, naturally ruling over the woman, a partnership based on shared virtues and the management of the household. It's a kinder, more companionate view than the stark contract of the Athenian legal system, but it's still one that is firmly patriarchal. He accepts the social structures, the seclusion of women, the authority of the husband as being rooted in the natural order of things. What about the seemire side of life, the brothels, the transcational sex? The philosophers, for the most part, are surprisingly quiet on this. They seem to accept it as a necessary, if regrettable, part of city life. It is beneath their notice. Their concern is with the souls and conduct of the elite, the citizen men who had the capacity for virtue. The suffering of a slave in a brothel was not a philosophical problem. It was simply a fact of life, like the weather. Here's a curious, and perhaps hypocritical, detail you might overhear from a group of less famous philosophers, the Cynics. The Cynics, like Diogenes, rejected all social conventions. They believed in living in natural life, free from the corrupting influence of society. For Diogenes, this meant living in a large ceramic jar in the middle of the Agora and famously satisfying his physical needs, including sexual ones, in public. He argued that, as natural, there is no shame in doing it openly. While this was an extreme view that shocked most Athenians, it represents a radical critique of the elaborate, hypocritical dance of public decorum and private license that you've witnessed. Diogenes, in his own way, was pointing out the absurdity of it all. The question of whether these philosophical ideas actually influence the behavior of the average Athenian is, of course, a source of endless scholarly debate. Did the men at the symposium really think they were climbing Plato's ladder of love? Or were they just enjoying the company of a handsome youth? Did a husband treat his wife with Aristotelian friendship? Or as the legal property the law defined her? As the philosophers provide a fascinating commentary on the world around them? But they were also a product of it. They challenged some norms, reinforced others, and ignored many more. Their high-minded theories offer another layer of complexity, another lens through which to view this strange world, but they don't offer any simple answers. You've heard the philosophy, you've witnessed the rituals, you've peeked into the private homes. But how did the average Athenian, the one who wasn't writing philosophical dialogues, see and process this world? To get a feel for the popular imagination, you turn to the most abundant and democratic art form of the era, the painted vase. Athenian pottery was a massive export industry. These clay pots, amphorae for wine, K-raters for mixing, K-waligs for drinking, hydrae for water, were the Tupperware and fine china of the ancient world, used in every aspect of daily life. And they were decorated with pictures. Thousands upon thousands of these vases survive, creating an unparalleled visual record of Greek life, myth, and, yes, sex. Looking at these pots is like scrolling through the Instagram feed of ancient Athens. You find yourself in the Keramikos, the potter's quarter of Athens. It's a bustling, dusty neighborhood filled with the smoke of kilns and the smell of wet clay. You watch an artist at work. HES, not a high-status sculptor, HES, a skilled craftsman. With a fine brush, he paints figures onto a kylix, a wide, shallow drinking cup. The figures are black against the red-orange of the clay, the famous black figure style. What is he painting on the inside of the cup? The image that a drinker would see as he finished his wine. It's a scene from a symposium. This is our key historical point. Athenian vase painting is one of our richest and most direct sources for understanding social practices, including sexuality. But it must be interpreted with care. You see men reclining on couches, playing cote boss, listening to a flute girl. These are the scenes we've already explored, but now they are frozen in time. They confirm the visual reality of these all-male parties. The details are invaluable. We see the types of furniture they use, the clothes they wore or didn't wear, the instruments they played. Then you pick up another kylix. This one is in the later red figure style, where the figures are left in the natural red of the clay and the background is painted black, allowing for more detailed and fluid lines. The scene is more explicit. It depicts a courtship. A bearded heiress offers a gift, a purse full of money, to a beardless hero. The boy looks away with that practiced air of modesty, but his hand is reaching back to accept the gift. The transactional nature of the relationship is laid bare, painted for all to see. These images weren't hidden away, they were on common drinking cups, used openly at the very parties they depicted. The range of sexual activity shown on these vases is staggering. There are scenes of heterosexual couples, often in mythological context, like Zeus seducing a mortal woman. There are countless scenes of pederastic courtship and intimacy, often showing that thigh position we discussed earlier, reinforcing its social acceptability. And then there are the more explicit scenes, the ones that often end up in the restricted section of a museum. These vases, clearly intended for the symposium market, show scenes with hetera and their clients in a variety of poses. They are surprisingly frank, a visual celebration of the pleasures that were a central part of the symposium experience. But here's a crucial detail for interpreting these images. Are they realistic depictions of everyday life, or are they idealized fantasies? The answer, which historians constantly grapple with, is both. The scenes are realistic in that they depict a recognizable social world. The furniture, the clothing, the activities, these are all grounded in reality. But they are also idealized. The figures are always young, beautiful, and athletic, conforming to the Greek ideal of kalokograthia. You don't see old kogathia, you don't see old kalokobra, overweight or unattractive people on these vases. It's a curated, beautified version of their world, a form of ancient airbrushing. Furthermore, context is everything. A scene painted on a hydria, a water jar used by women, will be very different from a scene on a kylix used by men at a symposium. Faces associated with women tend to show domestic scenes, weaving, caring for children, fetching water, or mythological scenes with female protagonists. Faces for the male sphere are where you find the symposium scenes, the athletics, the pederasty, and the explicit sexual content. The pottery itself was gendered, reflecting the separate worlds that men and women inhabited. A particularly strange and debated set of images involves satyrs. Satyrs, the mythical half-man, half-goat companions of Dionysus, are shown in a state of constant, cartoonish arousal, chasing nymphs and maenads. They are often depicted in ways that would be completely unacceptable for a human citizen. This has led some scholars to argue that safe space for depicting unrestrained male desire. By putting these behaviors onto mythical creatures, the artists could explore the wilder side of sexuality without directly implicating the respectable citizen. The satyr could do what the man could only fantasize about. Looking at these vases, you get a sense of the visual language of this culture. They were not shy about depicting the human body or sexual activity. But it was all framed within their specific social codes and ideals. The images tell a story not just of what they did, but of how they wanted to see themselves as beautiful, pleasure-loving, and sophisticated people, even when indulging in the most earthly of pursuits. You've been deeply immersed in the world of Athens, its philosophies, its social codes, its particular brand of structured chaos. But it's crucial to remember that Athens was not Greece. It was just one city-state, one model of Hellenic life. To get a sense of the diversity of the Greek world, you decide to take a mental journey to Athens' great rival, the city-state that was a walking, talking contradiction to almost everything Athens stood for. Sparta. If Athens was a city of poets, artists, and debaters, Sparta was a city of soldiers. Everything, and I mean everything, in Spartan society was geared towards one goal: producing the most formidable military machine in the known world. This singular focus created a society with a completely different set of rules, especially when it came to men, women, and their relationships. First, let's look at the women. You leave the secluded Athenian gynaeceum and arrive in a Sparta that would have shocked any Athenian visitor. You see girls exercising out in the open. They are not weaving or learning to manage a household. They are running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin and discus, often competing against each other. And they are not bundled up in heavy robes, they wear a short, simple tunic called a peplos, which was slit up the side, earning them the nickname Phanom rides or thigh showers from other Greeks. Why this radical difference? The Spartans had a brutally pragmatic logic. This is our main point. Spartan women were trained to be physically fit, because the state believed strong mothers produced strong sons, that is, future soldiers. A healthy, athletic woman would produce healthy, athletic babies. It was a state-sponsored eugenics program. A woman's primary duty was still to bear children for the state, but the Spartans believed the best way to do that was to make her as strong as the men. This public role for women extended beyond athletics. Spartan women were famous throughout Greece for their confidence, their outspokenness, and their Athenian counterparts. They could own and inherit property in their own right. In fact, by the classical period, a significant portion of Spartan men, some sources like Aristotle claim, as much as 2/5 was owned or managed by women. This gave them an economic power and independence that was unthinkable in Athens. They were not sequestered. They were expected to run the estates and manage the helots, the enslaved population of Sparta, while the men were busy with their military training. Now for the men. A Spartan boy was taken from his family at the age of 7 and entered into the Agora, a brutal, state-run military training program that would last for the rest of his youth. He lived in a barracks with his age group, subjected to harsh discipline, constant physical training, and ritualized deprivation to make him tough. His loyalty was not to his family, but to his comrades and to the state. This all-male, communal living had a profound impact on their social and sexual norms. Marriage for Spartans happened much later than in Athens. Men typically married around the age of 30, and women around 18 or 20. The age gap was smaller, and the partners were closer to being peers. But here's a truly bizarre detail about Spartan marriage. Even after a man was married, he continued to live in the barracks with his fellow soldiers until he was 30. He would have to sneak out of the barracks at night and sneak back in before dawn. This practice of marriage by capture, where the husband had to visit his wife in secret, was believed to keep their desire for each other strong and lead to more vigorous offspring. The secrecy and difficulty were part of the design. Pederastic relationships were also common in the Spartan Agora, but they took on a different flavor. Like in Athens, it was an institutionalized relationship between an older warrior and a younger trainee. It was seen as a crucial part of the boy's education, a way to transmit the values of courage and honor. However, the writer Xenophon, an admirer of Sparta, insisted that these relationships were purely focused on mentorship and character building, not physical intimacy. Like Plutarch, are more ambiguous, suggesting that while physical relationships were possible, they were judged based on the character of the individuals involved. The debate among historians continues: was Spartan pederasty an unsexual form of mentorship, as its proponents claimed, or was this just a facade to present a more noble image to the outside world? Sparta presents you with a completely different model. Women were more visible, more athletic, and more economically powerful. Men were subjected to a lifetime of state-controlled discipline. Marriage was a secret affair for years. The entire system was a stark, functional, and often brutal machine designed for military supremacy. It lacked the philosophical debates and artistic flourishing of Athens, but it possessed a strange and formidable logic of its own. It's a powerful reminder that there was no single ancient Greek way of life. The experience of love, sex, and family could be radically different just a few days' journey away. You've seen the different roles, relationships, and rituals across the Greek world. Now it's time to drill down to one of the most fundamental, underlying principles that governed male sexuality in both Athens and Sparta, and indeed, across most of ancient Greece. It's a concept that can be difficult for the modern mind to grasp because our culture tends to focus on the gender of one's partner. For the Greeks, that was often secondary. What mattered far more was not who you had sex with, but what your role was in the act. The crucial distinction was between being the active partner and the passive partner. This is the absolute core concept for understanding Greek male sexuality, the penetrative versus the penetrated. To be the active, penetrating partner was to be masculine, dominant, and in control. This was the proper role for a freeborn, adult male citizen. To be the passive, penetrated partner was to be submissive, to be treated like a woman, and to lose honor. This was the role assigned to women, to slaves male or female, and in a very specific and carefully managed way, to the adolescent eromenos for a temporary period. This active-passive binary is the key that unlocks so many of the seemingly contradictory attitudes you've witnessed. It explains why it was perfectly acceptable for a citizen man to have sex with his wife, a male or female prostitute, and a young boy, all without it causing a major identity crisis. In every single one of these relationships, he was expected to be the dominant, active partner. His masculinity was not defined by the gender of his object of desire, but by the role he performed. This is why there was such immense social anxiety around the conduct of the eromenos in a pederastic relationship. The boy was a future citizen. He could not be seen to be passive in a way that would permanently compromise his masculinity. This is why interseurifying was promoted as the ideal physical act. It avoided the symbolism of feminizing penetration. It's also why the boy was expected to be reluctant and not show pleasure. To enjoy being the passive partner would suggest an unmanly nature, a grave dishonor that could haunt him for the rest of his life. The stigma attached to the passive role was immense. A man who was known to enjoy being penetrated, or who sold his body for this purpose, was considered contemptible. He was often mocked in comedies with a slew of insulting terms, the most common being kina eidos or china. Eidos was a man who was seen as effeminate in his dress, his walk, his speech, and, most damningly, in his sexual preferences. He was a stock character of ridicule, the antithesis of the ideal, self-controlled, masculine citizen. Here's a specific and fascinating detail that brings this shame into the political arena. We have surviving court speeches where this very prejudice is used as a weapon. In one famous speech against Timarchus by the orator Rhesinus, the entire case is built on accusing his political rival, Timarchus, of having been a prostitute in his youth. Rhesinus argues that because Timarchus sold his body and willingly took on the passive role, he forfeited his right to be an active citizen. He quotes the law that forbids a man who has been a prostitute from speaking in the public assembly. The argument is, how can a man who has treated his own body like a slave be trusted to make decisions? For the free men of the city, the speech is a brutal character assassination, playing on the deepest fears and prejudices of the all-male jury. It demonstrates that sexual reputation was not a private matter, it was a public, political issue that could be used to destroy a man's career. The question of whether this rigid active-passive binary perfectly described the reality of everyone's private lives is, of course, something historians debate. There were surely relationships between men of the same age, partnerships that might not have fit neatly into this dominant-submissive model. But these relationships are largely invisible in the historical record precisely because they didn't conform to the social ideal, the dominant culture, the one reflected in law, in art, and in public discourse was overwhelmingly focused on this binary. You realize that you can't apply modern categories like homosexual or heterosexual to this world. They simply don't fit. The Greeks didn't have a concept of a fixed sexual orientation in our sense. They had a concept of proper and improper masculine behavior. A man's desire could be directed at both women and boys without contradiction. His honor, his status, his very identity as a man, depended not on where he found his pleasure, but on the unwavering performance of dominance. It was a worldview built not on identity, but on action. Given this complex web of social rules, honor codes, and public performances, you start to wonder, where does the law fit in? Did the Athenian state, so famous for its legal system, actually legislate morality? When you begin to sift through the fragments of Athenian law, you discover something surprising. The law was, for the most part, not concerned with what consenting adults did in private. It was concerned with something else entirely: status, property, and the integrity of the citizen body. The legal system didn't have a category for crimes against morality in the way a modern, religiously influenced code might. There was no law against a man sleeping with another man, or against him visiting a brothel. The state simply did not care about the private, consensual sexual acts of its citizens, as long as they conformed to that crucial active-passive hierarchy. This is our core point. Athenian law regulated the consequences and status implications of sexual acts, not the acts themselves. So what did the law care about first and foremost? It cared about protecting the purity of the citizen family. This is where the harshest laws were focused. Adultery, for instance, was a very serious offense, but it was defined in a very specific way. Adultery, or moikia, was defined as a man having sex with a married citizen woman, the wife, daughter, sister, or mother of a male citizen. The crime was not about passion or betrayal of love. It was a property crime. The woman was considered the property of her husband or kyrios, and the adulterer had violated his property rights. More importantly, the act threatened the legitimacy of the family line. It created uncertainty about the paternity of any future children, thereby threatening the integrity of the entire citizen roster. The punishment for being caught in the act of moikia was severe. The law gave the husband the right to kill the adulterer on the spot, without a trial, while historians debate how often this justifiable homicide was actually carried out. Its existence in the law shows how seriously the offense was taken. The adulterous wife could not be killed, but she faced a kind of social death. Her husband was legally required to divorce her. She was barred from participating in public religious festivals, and if she tried to, anyone could abuse her short of killing her. She became a public disgrace. Now, compare this to a man having sex with a non-citizen woman, like a metic or a slave. This was not moikia, it was not a crime at all. A man could have long-term relationships with hetero or visit brothels with complete legal impunity because these acts did not threaten the citizen bloodline. The law's silence on these matters is as telling as its loudness on the subject of adultery. What about protecting the youth? As we've seen, there was the law against hybris, the outrageous act of insolence. This could be used to prosecute a man who forced himself upon a freeborn boy. But again, the legal focus was on the dishonor. It was about treating a future citizen like a slave. It was a crime against his status. Another law, famously attributed to the early lawgiver Solon, supposedly forbade slaves from entering the gymnasium or having pederastic relationships with free boys. A weird detail, right? The point of this law wasn't to protect the slaves, it was to protect the institution of pederasty for the citizens, to keep it as an exclusive, elite practice, untainted by the lower classes. The law you heard about earlier, the one Aeschylus used against Timarchus, is another perfect example. The law didn't say it is illegal to be a prostitute. It said, if you have been a prostitute, you lose your civic rights to speak in the assembly. It was a law about political participation, not sexual behavior. It regulated the consequences for one's status, not the act itself. This is a subtle but crucial distinction that runs through all of Athenian law. Historians are still trying to piece together the full picture of Athenian law from scattered sources, court speeches, quotes from later authors, fragments of inscriptions. We don't have a single complete law code. This means there's a lot of debate about how these laws were applied in practice. For instance, did juries really not care about the emotional harm to a victim of assault? Or is that just how the lawyers had to frame the argument to win? It's hard to say for sure. What becomes clear, however, is that the law was a tool designed to uphold the existing social and political order. It was there to protect the property of male citizens, to ensure the legitimacy of their heirs, and to maintain the clear, rigid distinctions between citizen and non-citizen, free and slave, honorable and dishonorable. What happened outside of those specific concerns was largely left to the realm of public opinion, social pressure, and personal reputation, a court that was, in many ways, just as powerful as the legal one. The law may have been concerned with status and property, but the court of public opinion was obsessed with something far more fluid and dangerous: reputation. In the intensely personal, face-to-face world of Athenian politics, a man's honor was his most valuable currency, and sexual slander was one of the most potent weapons for destroying it. You decide to attend a session of the ecclesia, the public assembly, where all male citizens could gather to debate and vote on the affairs of state. What you witness is not a sober discussion of policy, but a masterclass in political mudslinging. The speaker on the beam or the stone platform is not just arguing against his opponent's proposed naval strategy. He is attacking his opponent's character. He drops hints about his rival's unmanly nature. He might use a carefully chosen word, like calling him soft a woman his age. He might make a joke about the expensive perfumes his rival wears, or the way he minces when he walks. He doesn't need to make a direct accusation, the innuendo is enough. A crowd of thousands of citizens gathered on the PMYXL roars with laughter. The political point is lost, but the personal attack is landed. This was standard practice in Athenian democracy. This is our core idea. Sexual innuendo and outright slander were common and accepted tools in Athenian political rhetoric. Because so much of politics was about personal persuasion, discrediting the speaker was as effective as discrediting his argument. And accusing a man of failing to live up to the city's strict ideals of masculinity was a severe way to undermine his authority. The attacks could come from many angles. A politician might be accused of being uxorious or excessively devoted to his wife, a sign that he was being ruled by a woman, which was seen as deeply unmanly. He was letting the private, female world of the oikos dominate his public, male life. This was a common line of attack used against Pericles, with critics claiming that his intelligent partner, Aspasia, was the real author of his speeches. The charge was designed to make him look weak in control. Alternatively, a man could be attacked for his excesses. A speaker might accuse his rival of spending too much time at decadent symposia, of drinking unmixed wine, and of consorting with extravagant hetairai, or, even worse, with lowly prostitutes. This painted him as a man lacking self-control. Sophrosyne, one of the most important Greek virtues. If a man couldn't control his own appetites, the argument went, how could he be trusted to manage the affairs of the city? But the most venomous attacks, as you saw with the case of Timarchus, were those that questioned a man's conduct in his youth. A rumor started by a political enemy that a man had been a passive partner in a pederastic relationship or had accepted money for favors could be devastating. Even if it wasn't true, the stain of the accusation could stick. The opponent didn't have to prove it in a court of law, he just had to plant the seed of doubt in the minds of the voting public. Here's a peculiar and telling detail about this culture of slander. It wasn't just confined to the political assembly. The comic plays performed at the great Gynaeceum festivals were a major vehicle for public character assassination. Playwrights like Aristophanes were famous for their savage, no-holds-barred satire of prominent citizens. They would write plays where well-known politicians and philosophers were depicted as buffoons, cowards, or sexual deviants. One favorite target was a politician named Cleon, whom Aristophanes relentlessly mocked for his boorishness. Another was the philosopher Socrates, who was depicted in the play The Clouds as a bumbling, amoral fraud. These comedies were performed in front of tens of thousands of people. It was like having a brutal caricature of you go viral to the entire voting population. The question of how much these comedic portrayals actually influenced public opinion is a huge topic of debate for historians. Did people see it as just entertainment, or did the relentless mockery shape their perceptions of these public figures? You realize that in Athens, there was no clear line between public service and private life. A man's entire life was subject to public scrutiny. His gait, his dress, his choice of companions, the rumors about his youth, all of it was fair game. Reputation was a fragile thing, built over a lifetime, but easily shattered by a single, well-aimed insult in the assembly or a vicious caricature on the comic stage. This constant threat of public shaming must have been a powerful force for social control, compelling men to conform, or at least to appear to conform, to the city's rigid masculine ideals. It was a system that demanded a constant performance of honor, a performance where one slip-up could mean political ruin. Your journey through ancient Greece is drawing to a close. You've navigated the sun-baked streets of Athens, lingered in the shadows of the gymnasium, and crossed the thresholds of both the cloistered gynaeceum and the boisterous and drawn. You've witnessed the contracts of marriage, the transactions of desire, and the wild release of festivals. Now, you stand at a temporal distance, looking back, and you begin to see how this complex, alien world eventually faded and how its memory became distorted over the centuries. The decline of the classical Greek world was a slow, drawn-out process. The Peloponnesian War, the long and draining conflict between Athens and Sparta, exhausted the city-states, leaving them vulnerable. Then came the rise of Macedon under Philip and his son. Alexander's conquests fundamentally changed the Mediterranean world. The small, independent city-state, the polis which was the crucible for all the social structures you've observed, was replaced by vast, multicultural Hellenistic empires. In these new, sprawling kingdoms, the old ideal of the citizen-soldier-politician began to fade. The intimate, face-to-face nature of public life disappeared. A man's identity was no longer so tightly bound to his performance in the assembly or his reputation among a few thousand of his peers. This shift had a profound impact on social and sexual norms. The institution of pederasty, so closely tied to the educational system of the citizen elite, lost its central, civic function. But it gradually morphed into a more private matter of personal preference, rather than a public institution of mentorship. This is our final major historical point. The transition from the classical Greek polis to the larger Hellenistic and Roman worlds led to a shift away from public, institutionalized pederasty and towards a greater emphasis on the private marital family. The focus began to shift inward toward the private family. In the Hellenistic and, later, Roman worlds, there was a growing emphasis on the importance of the marital bond, and even on the idea of love and companionship between husband and wife, concepts that were largely peripheral in classical Athens. Then came the rise of new philosophical schools and religions. Stoicism, with its emphasis on self-control and duty, promoted a more restrained and private view of life. But the biggest game changer, of course, was the eventual spread of Christianity. With its radically new moral framework, Christianity introduced concepts that were utterly foreign to the classical Greek mindset. It championed chastity as a virtue, condemned sexual acts outside of procreative marriage, and crucially, it made no distinction between active and passive roles. All sexual acts between two men, for instance, were seen as equally sinful. This new morality buried the old Greek system under a thick layer of shame. For centuries, the frank and complex sexuality of the ancient Greeks was either ignored, censored, or completely misunderstood. Victorian-era scholars, for example, were often so scandalized by the pederastic themes in Plato's dialogues that they would either mistranslate them or write lengthy, apologetic footnotes explaining the tool of friendship. They couldn't reconcile their image of Greece as the cradle of noble philosophy with the reality of its social customs. Here's a final, curious detail about this historical forgetting. For a long time, the explicit vase paintings you saw were kept hidden away in the secret cabinets of museums, deemed too obscene for public viewing. They were treated as a shameful perversion, a secret deviation from the clean, white marble world of classical beauty. It has only been in the last few decades that scholars have begun to look at this evidence more openly and honestly, trying to understand this world on its own terms, rather than judging it by modern standards. And this is where the biggest and most enduring debate among historians lies. How do we, in the 21st century, look back at this world? It is impossible not to feel a sense of profound unease. We see a society that created timeless art and philosophy, yet was built on slavery and the subjugation of women. We see an ideal of mentorship that is inextricably linked with what we would today call child exploitation. We see a celebration of male love that existed alongside a brutal disregard for the humanity of those who were not part of the elite male club. There are no easy conclusions to draw. To condemn the Greeks wholesale is to ignore the complexity and the genuine differences in their worldview. To romanticize them is to whitewash the cruelty and injustice that were fundamental to their society. Perhaps the only honest approach is to do what you have just done, to observe, to listen, and to sit with the profound, unsettling discomfort of it all. The world of ancient Greece was not a simple place of heroes and philosophers. It was a messy, contradictory, and deeply human world whose echoes still challenge our own assumptions about love, power, and what it means to be civilized. And so the sounds of the ancient city begin to fade. The distant echo of the symposium's laughter, the rhythmic clack of the loom from the silent gynaeceum, and the ghost of a philosopher's voice debating under an olive tree, they all dissolve into a gentle quiet. The sharp, sun-bleached edges of the Parthenon soften and blur, melting into the deep, velvety darkness behind your closed eyes. You can feel the weight of the day, the weight of the day, the weight of history, beginning to lift from your shoulders, replaced by the comfortable heaviness of approaching sleep. Your thoughts, once racing to keep up with the strange customs and challenging ideas, now begin to drift, unmoored, floating on the slow, steady current of your own breathing. You are no longer in Athens. You are in that peaceful, in-between space, that gentle entryway to the world of dreams. The questions and contradictions of the past can rest now. They have played their part. Let them settle like dust on ancient pottery, silent and still. There is nothing more to analyze, nothing more to understand. There is only the soft darkness, the gentle hum in the background, and the quiet invitation to let go. The end of the article. Good night.